The operating room had gone silent for the wrong reason. The monitor beside the patient was sounding an irregular alarm, and Dr. Adrian Vale had just ordered everyone to stop moving while blood pressure continued to fall. No one questioned him because no one in that room questioned Adrian Vale. He was the kind of surgeon whose name appeared in medical journals, conference programs, and hospital fundraising brochures, a man accustomed to being obeyed before he finished speaking. But across the operating table stood Elena Marlowe, a senior surgical nurse with silver beginning to show at her temples, watching the monitor with an expression that was strangely calm. Her gloved hands remained steady. Her eyes moved once from the patient to the instrument tray, then to the small digital clock mounted above the anesthesia station. Something was wrong. Not with the patient. With the procedure. The patient was a 62-year-old man who had arrived that morning with a rare vascular condition that had already resisted 2 conventional treatments. His family had been told the operation was complicated but controlled. They had been told the surgical team had performed similar interventions before. What they had not been told was that the procedure Dr. Vale was performing had never been openly documented in any medical textbook. It belonged to a restricted research program, one so tightly controlled that even most of the hospital staff had never heard its name. Elena knew that because she had seen the original protocol. She knew something else too. The sequence Dr. Vale was following was not the original sequence. The difference was tiny. To an inexperienced observer, almost meaningless. But Elena noticed it immediately. She had spent years learning to recognize danger in details other people ignored. A misplaced clamp. A monitor changing by 2 points. A pause lasting half a second too long. In surgery, those small things could become enormous. Dr. Vale leaned toward the operating field and asked for the next instrument. Elena handed it to him without hesitation. Then she saw the monitor drop again. The anesthesiologist frowned. Someone whispered that the pressure was falling faster than expected. Dr. Vale told everyone to remain calm. His voice was controlled, but his movements had become faster. Elena watched his hands. She knew that rhythm. She had seen it before years ago, in a room far colder than this one, beneath fluorescent lights in a government medical facility that did not officially exist. She had watched another surgeon make the same mistake. She had watched everyone remain silent because the surgeon was considered too important to question. She had promised herself that she would never make that mistake again. Dr. Vale asked for suction. Elena passed it. He adjusted his position and continued. The monitor alarm sounded again. This time, Elena spoke. She said that the sequence should be reversed. The room seemed to freeze. Dr. Vale looked at her over his mask. He asked what she had said. Elena repeated herself, quietly. She said the next step should not be performed yet. The anesthesiologist looked toward the surgeon. One of the younger residents lowered his eyes. Nobody wanted to be caught between them. Dr. Vale finally asked why. Elena glanced at the surgical field and said that the pressure change was consistent with an incomplete release at the previous stage. Dr. Vale stared at her for a moment, then told her to follow the protocol. Elena did not move. It was not defiance. It was hesitation born from recognition. The protocol he was following had been modified. Someone had changed the timing and removed a safeguard. She knew exactly which safeguard was missing because she remembered writing the sentence herself. Dr. Vale's voice became sharper. He asked if she had a problem with the procedure. Elena said no. Then he asked if she understood that the procedure was classified. That word changed the room. Classified. The resident looked up. The anesthesiologist stopped adjusting the controls for a moment. Even the circulating nurse seemed to hold her breath. Dr. Vale continued, telling Elena that only authorized personnel had access to the original material, and that she had no reason to question a procedure she had never been trained to perform. Elena looked at him for several seconds. Then she looked at the patient. The man's hand rested beneath the sterile drape, completely still. His life had been placed in the hands of people who believed they understood what they were doing. Elena knew better. She remembered a younger version of herself standing beside a drafting table covered with diagrams and handwritten corrections. She remembered long nights spent testing the technique. She remembered the first successful procedure, and the applause that followed. She remembered the second one. And she remembered the third. That memory was the reason she had spent the last 12 years working quietly in ordinary hospitals, refusing promotions, declining interviews, and allowing younger doctors to assume she was simply a nurse who preferred staying out of the spotlight. Dr. Vale asked again for the instrument. Elena did not give it to him. She said the patient could die if he continued. The words were not dramatic. They were almost gentle. That made them more frightening. Dr. Vale stepped closer and asked whether she was challenging him in front of his entire team. Elena said she was trying to protect the patient. He told her that if she interfered again, she would be removed from the room. Elena looked at the monitor. The numbers were getting worse. For a moment, she considered remaining silent. She knew what speaking could cost her. She knew what questions would follow. She knew that once the truth surfaced, the life she had built around anonymity would disappear. But then the patient moved slightly beneath the drape, a small involuntary motion that reminded her why she had learned the procedure in the first place. Elena reached toward the tray, picked up a different instrument, and placed it beside the surgeon's hand. She told him to wait. Dr. Vale stared at the instrument. His expression changed. He knew what it was. He asked where she had learned to recognize it. Elena said she had not learned it from a book. She had helped design it. The surgeon's eyes narrowed. He asked her name again, this time without irritation. Elena slowly removed her protective glasses and looked directly at him. She said her full name was Elena Marlowe, and 12 years earlier, she had been part of the team that wrote the original procedure. The room fell completely silent. Dr. Vale looked at her as though the person standing beside him had suddenly become someone else. Then Elena added one sentence that made his face lose its color. She said the version of the procedure he was using had never been approved by the person who created it. And somewhere outside that operating room, behind a locked hospital door, a sealed file bearing Elena's name was already being opened. For several seconds, nobody in the operating room moved. Dr. Adrian Vale stared at Elena as though her name had unlocked a memory he had spent years trying to forget, while the monitor continued its relentless warning beside the patient. He asked her what she meant by saying the procedure had never been approved by its creator. Elena did not answer immediately. She looked at the patient first. His condition was deteriorating, and every second spent arguing was another second stolen from the only decision that mattered. She told the anesthesiologist to prepare for a pressure collapse and asked the resident to bring the older vascular kit from the lower cabinet. Dr. Vale objected, saying the cabinet contained equipment that was no longer part of the protocol. Elena calmly replied that was precisely the problem. The surgeon stepped toward her and demanded to know how she knew what was inside that cabinet. Elena looked at him and said that she had designed the original inventory. The words seemed to travel through the room more slowly than they should have. A nurse near the wall lowered her eyes. The youngest resident looked between them, suddenly realizing that the quiet woman he had treated like another member of the support staff might know more about the operation than the surgeon holding the scalpel. Dr. Vale finally asked why she had disappeared. Elena said she had not disappeared. She had simply stopped allowing people to find her. Before anyone could ask another question, the operating room doors opened and 2 hospital administrators entered with a security officer. The older administrator carried a thin black folder. He looked at Elena and then at Dr. Vale and asked who had authorized discussion of the Marlowe protocol. Nobody answered. The patient's monitor alarmed again. Elena turned away from the administrators and told Dr. Vale they could investigate her later. Right now, the patient needed them to stop following the modified sequence. Dr. Vale hesitated. His career had been built on precision, authority, and the belief that the surgeon at the table was ultimately responsible for every decision. Trusting a nurse who had just revealed a classified past would mean admitting that he had been wrong. Worse, it would mean admitting that someone had allowed an altered version of a dangerous procedure to enter his operating room. The administrator ordered Elena to step away from the table. She refused. He reminded her that the material was classified and that unauthorized disclosure could have serious consequences. Elena looked at the patient and said that whatever consequences waited outside the room could wait a little longer. The patient could not. Dr. Vale asked her what would happen if she was wrong. Elena answered that if she was wrong, they would lose precious time. If she was right, they might save a life. That was enough to make him pause. He finally asked her what she would do. Elena gave him the sequence in precise terms, explaining which step had to be reversed and which safeguard had been removed from the modern version. The anesthesiologist followed her instructions. The monitor stabilized slightly. Nobody celebrated. It was too early. But the change was real. Dr. Vale watched Elena's hands as she guided the team through the adjustment. There was no hesitation in her movements. No excitement. No desire to prove herself. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone repeating work she had performed many times before. Then the monitor suddenly dropped again. Elena stopped. She stared at one of the readings and realized something was different. The complication was not caused by the altered procedure alone. Someone had changed another variable before the operation even began. Dr. Vale asked what she had found. Elena said the patient's preoperative measurements did not match the numbers recorded in the surgical file. The administrator immediately told her to stop. Elena ignored him. She asked for the original imaging. The resident brought it over. Elena studied the scan, then asked who had prepared the patient's file. Nobody answered. The administrator stepped forward and said the patient had been cleared through a restricted medical review. Elena asked who had authorized the review. Again, silence. Then Dr. Vale saw something that Elena had already noticed. A small identification code appeared on the edge of the file. He recognized it from an old government research program. His face changed. He asked Elena whether the patient had been selected because of his condition or because of something else. Elena finally looked at him and said she did not know. That was the first time her composure cracked. She admitted that she had spent 12 years believing the original program had been shut down after its final trial. She had believed the records were sealed because the procedure had been deemed too dangerous for public use. But now she understood that somebody had revived it. Someone had taken the old work, modified it, and brought it into a civilian hospital. The administrator ordered the security officer to remove the file from the room. Elena stepped between them. She told him that if he removed it now, the patient might die without anyone understanding why. The administrator whispered that she had no idea what she was interfering with. Elena answered that she knew exactly what she was interfering with because she had been there when the original procedure failed for the first time. Dr. Vale asked what she meant. Elena's eyes lowered. She said the first patient had been a young woman who volunteered for the trial because doctors promised her that the procedure could give her a future she had almost stopped believing in. Elena had helped design the technique. She had believed in it. She had believed the risks were controlled. But during that operation, something went wrong. The official report blamed Elena's team for an experimental error. The program was closed. Elena was told to sign a confidentiality agreement and never discuss it again. What the report never said was that the procedure itself had been changed without her knowledge. She had spent years believing she had failed that patient. That belief was why she left the research program and never returned. Dr. Vale stared at her and asked who had changed it. Elena said she never found out. The room became still again. Then the administrator opened the black folder and removed a single document. He looked at Elena with an expression that was no longer threatening. It was almost afraid. He told her that there was something she needed to see. He placed the document on the counter. Elena looked at the signature at the bottom and immediately recognized the handwriting. It belonged to the patient from 12 years ago. But the patient had been declared dead after the original trial. Elena stepped closer. Her face went pale. The signature was dated 3 years after the woman had supposedly died. And beneath it was a second line written in the same hand. It said that the procedure had never failed. Someone had made sure Elena believed it had. The signature changed everything. Elena stood beside the counter, staring at the document as though the years between then and now had suddenly collapsed into a single moment. The woman whose death had haunted her for 12 years had apparently signed a statement 3 years after the official record said she was gone. Dr. Vale read the document again, then looked toward the administrator and demanded to know why nobody had told him. The administrator did not answer. Instead, he opened the black folder and revealed photographs, medical reports, and archived correspondence showing that the original patient had survived. Her name was Claire Mercer. She had been moved into a protected medical program after the operation, not because she was dying, but because the people overseeing the research wanted to study the procedure without public scrutiny. Elena had been deliberately given a false report. The failure had been manufactured so she would leave the program believing she had caused Claire's death. But the deeper truth was even more disturbing. The modified procedure now being performed had been developed from Elena's original work without her permission, and the current patient had been selected because his condition offered an opportunity to test the altered version again. Dr. Vale slowly removed his gloves. For the first time since Elena had known him, there was no authority in his expression. Only disbelief. He asked whether the patient on the table had been knowingly enrolled in an experiment. Elena said she did not know whether he had been told the truth, but she knew one thing. The operation had to stop following the unauthorized sequence immediately. The administrators protested that stopping could be just as dangerous. Elena looked at the monitor and said that continuing would be worse. Dr. Vale faced the patient, then faced Elena. He had a choice to make. He could protect the reputation of the hospital, obey the people who had controlled the procedure for years, and continue pretending that the classified protocol was beyond question. Or he could trust the nurse standing beside him, even though doing so meant admitting that the person everyone had dismissed was the only one in the room who truly understood what had been done. He chose Elena. The team followed her instructions. The procedure was carefully reversed toward the original design, step by step, without rushing. Elena corrected small errors, identified missing safeguards, and explained what each change was meant to accomplish. Dr. Vale listened. He did not interrupt. He did not defend himself. He simply followed. Minutes passed. The monitor steadied. The room remained tense, but the alarms began to quiet. Elena finally looked at the patient's numbers and knew they had crossed the most dangerous point. She closed her eyes for one brief second. Then she opened them and continued working until the final stage was complete. When the procedure ended, the patient was transferred to recovery alive. Outside the operating room, Elena found Claire Mercer waiting in a wheelchair. She was older now, her hair gray, her face thinner than the photograph in the file, but the eyes were unmistakable. Elena stopped walking. Claire smiled. She told Elena that she had tried to contact her years ago, but every message had been intercepted. She said she had learned that Elena believed she was dead and had wanted to tell her the truth, but the people controlling the program had warned her that speaking would put others at risk. Elena sat beside her. For the first time in 12 years, she allowed herself to cry. Not because she was weak, but because the guilt she had carried had never belonged to her. Claire reached for her hand and told her something Elena would remember for the rest of her life. She said that the worst part was not being used as an experiment. The worst part was knowing that the person who cared most about her had been forced to believe she had failed. Elena looked through the glass toward the recovery room where the new patient was being monitored. Dr. Vale stood nearby, speaking with the medical team. He had already begun documenting everything that had happened, including the unauthorized modifications and the evidence hidden in the classified archive. The administrators could no longer quietly bury the truth. The hospital opened an investigation. The old program was finally exposed to independent oversight. The altered procedure was suspended, and every patient record connected to it was reviewed. Elena was asked to return to research medicine, but she refused the position they offered her. She said she had spent too many years watching people confuse knowledge with ownership. Instead, she agreed to help establish a review system where no classified medical technique could ever again be altered without independent approval and patient consent. Dr. Vale later apologized to her privately. He admitted that when she first challenged him, he had heard only a nurse questioning a surgeon. He said he had failed to hear the person behind the warning. Elena told him that was the problem with titles. They could make people listen to authority while teaching them to ignore experience. He asked whether she hated him for what happened in the operating room. Elena shook her head. She said she was grateful he eventually chose to listen. Then she looked through the window toward Claire, who was waiting quietly in the hallway. Elena said that sometimes the most important decision in a room is not knowing what to do. It is knowing when to let someone else speak. Years later, people would remember the case because of the classified procedure, the investigation, and the surgeon whose reputation nearly collapsed. But Elena remembered it differently. She remembered the moment when a room full of powerful people finally became quiet enough to hear the person they had overlooked. Because sometimes the person standing quietly at the edge of the room is not waiting for permission to matter. They are carrying the knowledge that everyone else needs. And when Elena eventually walked away from the hospital that evening, the sun was disappearing behind the city skyline, turning the windows gold, and for the first time in 12 years, she did not feel like someone running from the past. She felt like someone who had finally returned it to where it belonged. If this story stayed with you, perhaps let it remind you to listen a little longer before deciding who has something worth saying, because dignity is often found in the quietest voice, and sometimes one person being willing to listen can change everything.